In 1976, something happened that the world has yet to recover from. A man published a book. The man's name was Bill Kaysing, and if his name doesn't ring any bells, I'm afraid the titles of his previous books aren't going to help much either. Eat Well for 99 Cents a Meal didn't sell particularly well. Neither did his 1974 travel guide, Great Hot Springs of the West. And though perhaps due to its lengthy title rather than the quality of its content, the ex-urbanite's complete and illustrated easy-does-it first-time farmer's guide, A Useful Book, would suffer a similar fate. And while you may not have heard of Kaysing, or the titles of any of the books I just mentioned, you are undoubtedly familiar with his work, because in 1976, Bill Kaysing would achieve international fame with his book, We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion swindle. Now this video is about moon landing skepticism, but it's not a debunk, so to speak. Oh, sorry, let me make the lighting normal. Originally, I just wanted to explore the modern conspiratorial movement and how conspiracy theories had become so common in our everyday lives. So much so that if I say the words wood, liberty, and dancing, several people will feel like they were sleeper agents that just got activated. Instead, I was going to focus a lot more on the Kennedy assassination, because when you read historians who write about conspiracy theories, they'll all point to the Kennedy assassination as the moment when everything changed. It's often called the mother of conspiracy theories. Combine that with Watergate coming out a little over a decade later, and even rumors of MK Ultra appearing in 1974, and you can kind of see why the Kennedy assassination would have been such a spark, such a starting moment for the modern conspiracy movement to kick off. But the more I looked into it, the less Kennedy felt like a modern conspiracy theory. You see, the people who believe something was fishy about the Kennedy assassination can usually tell you exactly what happened. Was it the Dow Tech's building, the grassy knoll? Were they in the crowd? There's a lot of different theories around here, and the different camps will fight with each other and say the other camps are misguided or even just straight up wrong altogether. But in my mind, at least, a lot of the modern conspiracy theories aren't built on much. They're really built around just trying to poke holes in the official narrative. Gone are the days of people sneaking into restricted areas, or swimming to remote islands to gather evidence, or really fighting for the release of classified documents. No, instead, all it is now is just kind of poking holes in the official story. The onus on them isn't to provide you answers. It's not to tell you what happened. All that matters is the important thing. The evidence doesn't add up, and I'm just asking questions, or JAQing it for short. But as I'm going to argue over the course of this video, JAQing isn't really skepticism in the same way as the Kennedy assassination. Like, here's an example. Let's say I could provide a photo that very clearly showed the grassy knoll at the time the shot was fired, and that it was completely empty. There was no one on it. It's a full 360 aerial, whatever you want to say. Conspiracy theorists who believe that the shooter was on the grassy knoll will immediately engage with my photo. They're going to immediately try and revise some of their theories to make stuff work. And in the end, they may actually end up abandoning their theory. Maybe the whole thing entirely, but more likely than not, just picking a different one. But that's not how a JAQer would engage with my counter evidence. If I were to show a JAQer a photo of the grassy knoll with nothing on it, they're merely going to say, oh, well, but what about the fact that it would have been impossible to make that shot? If you disprove one piece of evidence to a JAQer, they'll just move on to a different piece of evidence. But if you can conclusively disprove one piece of evidence from a Kennedy conspiracist, maybe they'll move on to a different theory, but at the very least, they'll abandon the one they hold at that moment. And the more and more I looked into this, I started realizing just asking questions is very powerful. It preys on the natural skepticism that people have. That's good, and that we should encourage in people. But what it does is it twists it. And it twists it into making it feel like skepticism in and of itself is engagement with the underlying evidence. Now, that's not every single modern conspiracy theory, of course, and there certainly are conspiracy theories that I believe are happening even right now. But I do think one of the real problems with the modern conspiratorial movement is a lack of care over what the real story is. The doubt of the official story is far, far more important than a genuine truth claim to what actually happened. Now, in my research, I found that this change really seemed to happen with the moon landing conspiracy. But what's most interesting is, when you look at the history of it, when you look at how moon landing denial grew and changed over time, you get such an amazing window into how JAQing started, how it evolved, and what about asking questions makes it such a powerful tool. So that's what I want to do today. I want to go through 3 pieces of media to see how the moon landing and JAQing both evolved over time. First, we're going to go through Kaysing's book beat by beat. Then, we're going to look at what happened when moon landing denial went prime time, with Fox's special, Conspiracy Theory, Did We Land on the Moon? Finally, we'll look at how guerrilla warriors paved the way for comment cringe-saders, with the character of Bart SIbrel. Now this video is going to debunk many of the moon landing skeptics' main pieces of evidence, but I really want to remind you that's not the overall focus, though it's going to eat up quite a lot of the runtime. Instead, I want you to focus a lot more on how the theory constructs itself. What pieces of evidence does Kaysing look at, and how does that change when we get to the Fox special? And lastly, how do SIbrel's contributions tie the whole thing together? As always, if you want to double check me or learn more about anything I bring up in this video, you can check out my companion document linked in the video description, which will have direct links to all the sources I talk about, not behind a paywall when possible. And I'll note specific instances on screen like this, which basically just works like footnotes. Oh, and also, apologies for the continuity errors between my hair and the set and all that other fun stuff. I had to re-record this several times as I found out new information and realized more things, especially about our last topic, SIbrel. But I think it's best to start with a brief overview of Americans and their opinion on the moon landing that was already there when Bill Kaysing came along. Now, figuring out how many Americans denied the moon landing right when it happened is actually much trickier than you might think. You'll find a lot of articles claiming that even in 1969, less than 6 months after we went to the moon, there were a group of people who were already very publicly denying the moon landing. And eventually the author tracks these men down, tracing them to an organization, the Man Will Never Fly Society, whose motto is the ever elegant, "Birds fly, men drink." The website is filled with digs and jibes at these silly men who believe that metal can fly through the air. The article further goes on to talk about how at this meeting in late 1969, one of the co-founders of the organization got up to give a presentation on how the moon landing was obviously faked. They got up and presented photos and footage of men walking around in space, using scientific equipment, and other kind of spacey activities. However, the speaker then revealed that all of this had just been filmed by NASA as training footage. Therefore, all the claims of footage of the moon landing could have just been made up, and people really needed to make up their own minds. Now, the twist to this story is that the man who gave that presentation was named Julian Scheer. This man was actually one of the chief public affairs officers in charge of covering the space race, and was so involved in the Apollo program, he actually named the command module, Columbia. So why would a man so involved in NASA and spaceflight stand up and give a presentation like this? Did he believe the moon landing was fake? No. The Man Will Never Fly Society was a joke. It was an early example of what we now would call something like irony posting. Among the members of this society were former Navy pilots, airline CEOs, and according to the article, one guy who has no ties whatsoever to the aviation industry but just likes to show up and drink. Once a year, on the anniversary of the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk, they all get together, get really drunk, and then just sit around talking about how aviation is totally fake and there's no way any of it's real, which is really funny. So this is basically just a really old troll that a lot of people fell for. However, that's not the only piece of data we have to talk about how much people believed the moon landing when it happened. I came across one horrifically low quality scan from the Wisconsin State Journal that said of 1,700 people interviewed, which were just people who subscribed to their paper, 2 to 5% doubted the moon landing. And from the few quotes published, the argument seemed to be mostly either God wouldn't allow it, or it was faked in the Arizona desert. Now, if you do some digging, you'll find several claims that this number was actually as high as 30%, claimed by Peter Knight in his Conspiracy Theories in American History. However, he's referencing this article, and this article never makes a claim anywhere near that number. Even among population centers, the highest it gets is 13% in Macon? Actually, it's 19%. I found a slightly higher quality scan behind a paywall. I was unable to find the hard data for this survey. It's out there. It's in the Sunday edition of the Miami Herald. If anyone can find it, not behind a paywall, please send me an email or leave a comment. I would love to link it in my companion doc and credit you. Now, I was able to find a Gizmodo article, and several other articles referencing it, that claimed a Gallup poll found that 28% of Americans were skeptical of the moon landing at the time. Gizmodo references an article from the Daily Record, which itself just references that there is a Gallup poll. However, I can't find that specific Gallup poll, even in any of their archives. And on top of that, if you go to some of the more recent Gallup polls, they don't show any data from before 99 in some of their recent polls where they compare like how it's changed over time. So I'm a little skeptical of that number, but it's entirely possible, and I just wasn't able to find it. You can find a Gallup poll talking about support for how much money the government is spending on space travel and how that changes over time. And you can see the Apollo program was always very unpopular. From its inception, basically. People thought we should be spending a lot more on entitlements and a lot more on military assets, all the way up until 1976, when that number goes down and we're spending the right amount and we should spend more starts to go up to compensate. Regardless, though, the late 60s and early 70s was when a distrust in the American government was getting more and more popular. Not that that had ever completely gone away. After all, America was founded on distrusting our government. And so, Americans could not have been more ready to meet a man like Bill Kaysing. Now, Kaysing was a very interesting character, especially for someone who would go on to claim that we never landed on the moon. Kaysing was a World War II vet, and after the war he would actually go to officers' school, but retired before taking an official officer's position, instead becoming a writer, a technical writer. In the 50s he was hired by Rocketdyne, a company which made rockets. I know, creative. So when he came out claiming the whole thing was faked, people did take notice, enough that a few years later, NASA would actually specifically push back on some of Kaysing's claims. Now, the job title technical writer sounds, well, technical. So I think we should start by talking about what exactly that job entails. So a technical writer's primary function is to ensure ideas can be shared. If you've ever read a manual, like how to, start your car, troubleshoot it, turn on a computer or whatever, those were usually written by technical writers, 90% of the time. So these are people who are trying to translate technical stuff into a way that can be understood. Now, importantly, this doesn't necessarily mean they have to understand the technical stuff. Kaysing himself even admits in his book, I was actually hired in on overtime, although my knowledge of rockets and technical writing both equaled 0. Though Kaysing worked at Rocketdyne, he never worked on the Apollo missions directly. Now, I don't mean to say all that to poison the well against Kaysing. I myself am an independent researcher with no titles or background or anything else that should lend me any more authority on this topic than Kaysing. However, I also don't think you should be able to use his title to lend more credence to his claims, which is often why conspiracy theorists mention him like this. Instead, I think what you really gotta do is just deal with the evidence. And to that end, let's get into Kaysing's book. Kaysing begins the first section of his book, titled How This Book Came to Be Written, by claiming he never actually watched any of the moon landings. Instead, he deduced that they were fake from, and I quote, "Somehow, I seem to have perceived that the Apollo project had become a gigantic hoax." Literally, Star Wars level writing. He then says, now was the time to ask some questions of NASA, and then begins to JAQ it. He delivers us with such strokes as, why did the relatives of astronauts so often refer to the unreality of events? Was this because the events really were unreal? Is there any real assurance that the astronauts were actually aboard the Apollo vehicle? Also, is there any proof it really flew with a full load of fuel? Or did it make it off the pad because it was lightly and safely loaded, with engines running at reduced power? Culminating in my favorite, why was there never a mention of gold, silver, diamonds, or other precious metals on the moon? Wasn't this a viable consideration? Why was this fact never discussed in the press or by the astronauts? Obviously, not only are a lot of these questions not directed at NASA, the organization he claims we should be asking questions of, but they also don't really factor into the overall thing we're examining. Like in terms of astronauts' families saying that it felt unreal. If my sister left, for a week, and then I see her on TV on the moon, and then she comes back, I mean, I think it's just going to be hard for me to conceptualize, like, oh yeah, my sister was on another celestial body. Like, that's just going to be really, really hard for me to, wrap my head around. It's not an experience most people have. Now, fans of Kaysing will likely say I'm being unfair to Kaysing here, and frankly, that is fair. in an oxymoronic kind of way. But I'm going to answer his evidence. I'm not going to respond to the random JAQing. What I want to look at are the things he says as, see, this is why it is fake. I don't genuinely think for a second anyone is going to hang their hats on the astronaut's family said that maybe it was unreal. Again, all the questions are in the companion document. The whole book is in the companion document, 2 different versions of it. But it's just not worth it. He then briefly goes over the V2 rockets, the history of the space race, and though he stumbles a bit, check the companion doc for a fuller breakdown. He does a pretty good job talking about the history of Rocketdyne and includes some photos of the testing locations. He then takes a brief break to mention how the US government has lied in the past, though to my mind, I care less about this because, I mean, A, governments lie, shocker, but B, most of the stuff he talks about are lies people tell for military reasons. And while I understand the larger argument of the moon landings is that they were faked for military reasons, it's not that weird to me that the government would not be super honest about what military operations it's conducting, even if it's obvious to everyone else what really happened. So I don't know. To me, that doesn't speak to... The government does lie. I just think these are terrible examples of it. Chapter 3 is where he starts addressing some of the photos that we're going to be taking issue with, and that will appear quite a lot of times in the later stuff as well. But I'm going to leave that for the end of the book, because obviously after the end of Kaysing's book, a lot more of the conspiracy focuses very exclusively on the photos and video. So we're going to do a little set change for that. I will briefly say, though, and maybe this is just, I don't know, me being condescending given my experience, but I do find it very funny when he says in this photo, you know, I don't understand why the astronaut's face is lit up, which, you know, the astronaut taking the photo, he's wearing a giant white reflective spacesuit, you know, kind of like that. See how white this is? So if you imagine, you know, full sunlight hitting that and then going back and hitting the astronaut, obviously that's actually going to be a fair amount of bounce hitting the astronaut. I mean, again, the light that shines off the moon is enough to brighten up the Earth at night. Kaysing also makes a great deal of fuss over there not being much dust in the photos, under the assumption that the moon would have, you know, light fluffy sand as opposed to kind of clumpier soil. Without air, the dust isn't going to billow like we might think of on Earth. There isn't going to be, you know, as the dust moves, a bunch of air pressure building up behind it that's eventually going to be, you know, in a force to kind of force the sand back over to where it then falls back on top. Without that, it's just going to spread. Just going to move out. He'd put in a photo like this and then say, where are the stars? And this is what makes JAQing both so intriguing to the viewer and so difficult for experts to deal with. Because if I go outside at night, I can see stars. And if I get further away from streetlights, I can see even more stars. So why would astronauts, who are basically as far away from light pollution as you can possibly get, unable to capture photos of stars? It's a very reasonable question. Now, the answer is actually very simple, and it's the same reason that stars don't show up on old Polaroids either. Now, the moon glows in the nighttime sky because of sunlight. It's reflecting light from the sun back at Earth. So when you're standing on the moon, you're essentially in direct sunlight. With how bright it is, it's going to make it really difficult to include stars in the background with an appropriate exposure setting. In fact, astronauts report not being able to see many stars at all. And again, that actually makes sense, because when the sun is in the sky on Earth, you also can't see many stars. So if the sun is outside when you're on the moon, it's kind of reasonable to think that the light from the sun is going to drown out any light you might be able to see from stars. Now, I'll note that question, where are the stars, took about 2 seconds to ask, whereas my answer took about 2 minutes to get through. Maybe less or more, whatever, I'll put the time on screen right now. So that is one of the biggest problems that I think comes up when you're dealing with jack-offs. If you don't know about where are the stars beforehand, and you're a genuinely curious truth seeker, you're then going to go off and do your own research, much like I did. Then, when you find the answer, you can come back and respond to that question with, oh, here's why there are no stars. But now that you've dealt with that, what they're immediately going to ask is, okay, but what about the dust? And now you're going to have to go back and do that research, and at a certain point, the JAQer is going to win just by outlasting you. And I'm very much using air quotes there. The goal isn't to convince you, the person who's actually willing to do the digging. The goal is to convince a third-party observer who might respond with, well, wait, why aren't there stars though? What would the point even be in taking those out? And then someone says, it's because they couldn't accurately calculate the interpolation of the stars with the time when it was supposed to happen. And so as a result, they decided to just take them out altogether, rather than trying to make something up which could later be proven false, or worse yet, just using the natural stars of Earth in the background. And to a casual third-party observer, they might say, that seems like a reasonable answer, and move on. And boom. Now there's one more convert. One thing I am going to try and do, though, that I don't really think anyone else has done before, is I'm going to try to meet the conspiracy theorists where they are. What I mean by that is, occasionally, for some of these theories, I'm not directly going to address it with data. Instead, what I'm going to attempt to do for some of these theories is deal with it the way a conspiracy theorist would. I'm going to point out inconsistencies in the conspiracy theorist's theory. This channel started from fighting fire with fire, so I want to try that out here too. Kaysing then begins chapter 5 by just straight up calling out two people that I guess he used to work with, Bobby and Betty, for banging at work. I think his point here, because he'll kind of come back to this a bit, is about like government waste, which you're not getting paid on your lunch break, so frankly, go ahead and bang on your lunch break as far as I'm concerned, but hey, that's just me. But he doesn't even directly say they bang. I mean, he's very clearly implying it, but all he really says is, you know, they left for lunch without lunch or a camera. Why did he call this out? Was Bill Kaysing never invited? But again, this is my point. You can push back like this, and it's kind of a dumb argument. So if you do, you always have to keep in mind the reason you're pushing back like this is to make it so that if they start jacking, you can circle back to it. Because again, everyone knows what I'm saying, right? Like right now, I don't think anyone listening, let me put the lights back. Sorry. Like everyone listening to this right now knows what I'm implying, right? Like I'm saying that women didn't want to bang Bill Kaysing. That's what I'm saying. And if I were to retreat off that, if someone were to say, why are you being so mean to Bill Kaysing? And then I was going to be like, oh, no, I never said he was jealous. I just don't understand why he's bringing it up. It doesn't really have anything to do with government spending. I'm just asking questions over here. That's silly, because it's very clear why I'm asking the questions, what I'm trying to get at. And if Bill Kaysing were to take offense at that and say, hey, can you stop saying no one ever wanted to bang me? I wouldn't say he's silencing me or that somehow I must be right because he won't debate me on whether or not he banged. It's what I think, and I'm fine saying it. And speaking of things that I think and I'm fine saying, guess who's still raising money for Car for Ukraine? Yeah, that's right. You thought it was a 1 month thing. Nope, it is 3 months, baby. We are going next video too. I think, actually. I'm not sure about the timing. It might not be next video, but it's definitely going to be this one. For those who are unaware, Car for Ukraine is an NGO operating in Ukraine, staffed by Ukrainians, that was started after the war. And what they do is they buy cars from Europe, armor them, and then send them to the front lines. I'm trying to raise enough money for a Sprinter van so that we can kind of use it as a supply vehicle, troop transport, what have you. There's really cool stuff they do. There's a lot of other creators part of the fundraising as well. If you don't want to donate to me, feel free to donate to someone else as long as you donate. That's kind of all I care about. It's all handled through DonorBox, which is a trusted third-party donation service for charities and NGOs and the like. You can read a lot more about them in the video description. I'm going to post a link to donate to my specific campaign. But again, if you want to donate to a different YouTuber, a different campaign overall, that's fine too. You can see their white pages so that you can feel confident that all your money is going to a good place. And again, as always, last month, when we started this, I started the charge. I donated 500 euros because it means a lot to me. I didn't mention this in the last video because it feels emotions are cringe, I guess. But my brother-in-law is Ukrainian. And I'm fairly close with his family. I see them quite frequently. Honestly, this means a lot to me. Car for Ukraine reached out to me, and, it hit close to home. They said, hey, would you be willing to do this? And I immediately said yes. I responded so quickly. Because it just, I don't know, man. It's my family in a way. I mean, through marriage, I guess, but still. I know people have been very severely affected by this war, and it's just, Any help you can give would be very much appreciated. If you have a charity that you think would be good for this channel to donate to, post it and I'll reach out and see if they're willing to engage in some sort of partnership or something like that. Because, like, again, I feel very blessed that this channel has grown so much. And I want to be able to use that to give back to people. Because I think in many ways, when good things happen to you, you need to make sure good things happen to other people. That's spreading the wealth is how we get through. Thank you to everyone who has donated. We've already raised, I think about $2,500, 2,000 euros, somewhere in that range. But, you know, we still got a long ways to go. Anyway, back to Kaysing. Kaysing then points out there was one group at his worksite that was not transferred with the actual material that they were working with. And they basically spent 6 months doing nothing until they eventually were transferred. This is wasteful, but it also happens in large bureaucratic organizations. I myself have seen teams like this in companies that I've worked for, and I'm pretty sure I saw a news story fairly recently about someone who works for the government who just, like, some weird thing happened where, like, they can't be fired, but they also don't have any responsibilities anymore, so they just show up to work every day with nothing to do. So this kind of thing happens. It's bad, but I don't think you can hold this specific incident up to show that overall the project was just about stealing money from people. Kaysing ends chapter 5 by saying that statisticians say that 6 landings without a single failure is impossible, which, to his credit, isn't technically JAQing. He's just appealing to a vague authority. I'd really want to know what those statistics were. And then on top of that, does he not consider Apollo 13 a failure? Did he not see? I guess the Tom Hanks movie hadn't come out yet and he didn't watch it, so maybe he didn't know about it. Chapter 5 also contains my absolute favorite question, where at one point he just goes, you know, let's look at all these steps. And then he kind of just makes derisive comments under all of them. About halfway through, he says, doesn't all this seem a bit complicated? To which I physically had to restrain myself from saying, yeah, it's not exactly rocket science. Chapter 6 is very short, which talks about the fire of Apollo 1, which was a horrific tragedy in which 3 astronauts burned to death on the, I guess it's not tarmac, launch pad. The rocket wasn't going to take off, it was just a test, but there was some faulty wiring. The cabin was being filled with oxygen at the time because one of the things they were testing was oxygen-rich environments and whether it made sense to basically give astronauts like a highly oxygen-rich environment, and then they'd breathe in and out and kind of, you know, naturally when you exhale you have your own carbon dioxide, so you'd neutralize it that way, or if they should give them breathing tubes or whatever. It was a very early test to try and figure that out. Because of the highly oxygenated environment, though, the whole cabin caught fire. And the fire actually spread to the, you know, the lining, the interior, not the interior, like the wall of the shuttle. And, you know, unfortunately, the door couldn't open because obviously the, well, I mean, there's multiple theories. I'm sure people are going to tell me I'm wrong about this, but from what I have read from the report, it was that the fire basically destroyed the door's control mechanisms. So the door had no way to communicate to open, because obviously if you're designing a door that's going to make it through space, you want to make sure that door doesn't just open randomly. People couldn't really get close to the launch pad because people were very worried that it was going to turn into a bomb, that it was going to ignite, you know, some of the other chemicals in there, and that it was going to explode. And on top of that, the chemicals that it was burning through were quite toxic. So there was very thick black smoke kind of choking the area. So people weren't really able to get close enough to deal with the astronauts. Overall, it was a very, very serious tragedy. Very, very sad. He ends the chapter with, our contention. If any agency of the government could not handle a relatively simple problem on the ground, how could it expect to handle a complex problem or problems in space? Which, A, that's not a contention. Contentions definitionally are declarative statements. But also, B, maybe they learned from the experience. Mission to the Moon, the book he cites, very clearly points out that after this, they put fire suppression systems in the Apollo shuttles. There was a lot that could go wrong, and they were aware of that. I think Apollo 13's abortion is really good evidence of some of the problems they knew might come up and some of the protocols they developed to deal with those problems, but how those protocols couldn't encompass every single problem that could potentially occur. Now, more modern theories say that the astronauts were killed because one or all of them were about to talk. However, if you take that approach, then you have to abandon Kaysing's earlier JAQ about, well, how could they, how could they have dealt with the problem in space if they couldn't deal with such a simple fire on the ground? Because if the fire was intentional, then obviously they could deal with it because they'd planned it in the first place. So anyway, either the fire was intentional and it has no bearing on the difficulty of the project, or the fire wasn't intentional and it does, but you can't have it both ways. Moving on to Chapter 7, Kaysing then again is talking about wasteful government spending again. But I don't know, just a lot of these arguments just kind of ring hollow to me. I don't know. I feel like people will attack me for this, for not refuting what he's saying strongly enough. But like one of his things is that the astronauts were very, treated very well. They lived in places with pools and they got to go gamble in Vegas and stuff like that. But it's also like, you're hiring these guys to go into space where they might die, and 3 of them died in a fire. Like, I don't know, I guess in my mind it's just like, why wouldn't you try and make these guys' lives as nice and easy as possible? The military spending a lot of money on their, to reuse a joke, top guys doesn't really seem that surprising to me. Secondly, he talks about how secretive and protected the Nevada base was, which, again, like, the government being secretive about rocket technology during the space race, which was a lot about rocket technology, it just doesn't seem that weird to me. I don't know, like, I get it, but it just doesn't seem that weird. Honestly, Chapter 7 is a fantastic example of one of the strengths of JAQing it. I'm being forced to take a much stronger position to deal with a very nebulous one, Kaysing is just saying the base was secretive. I wonder why. Maybe they were faking it. I don't know, but it's weird that it was so secret, wasn't it? And then I have to take the much stronger position of, well, but I mean, yeah, it makes sense that they have a base to protect military secrets. And I'm sure someone could say, well, there's military secrets at other bases, and they're not protected nearly so stringently. Why is that? I don't know, maybe the Rocketdyne place wasn't protected so secretly or something. I don't know. But it's like, it's difficult because I end up having to take like a very, very firm position to deal with a very nebulous one. I stand by my firm position. I'm not trying to use that to wiggle out of it or anything. But it's like, this is when you deal with jackoffs, this is really a big part of the game. You are going to have to beat a question with a very, very serious and direct statement. But sometimes responding to a question with a question is actually a legitimate response. Then, at the end of the chapter, he makes my life so much easier by making his first serious, genuine, declarative statement with nothing to back it up. Once the decision to simulate all moon voyages was made, NASA and the Defense Intelligence Agency moved swiftly. A code name was created, ASP, Apollo Simulation Project, and the effort was divided into the following tasks. 1. Secret top-level organization and management. 2. Intensive security, including counterintelligence. 3. Undercover procurement of personnel. 4. Clandestine equipment design, manufacture, installation, and operation. 5. Cover-up communications, including wiretaps and taping. 6. Covert planning and special projects. Aerospace, plumbers. Which, like, what? Where's he getting this from? Like, Kaysing never claimed to be part of the cover-up or part of anything involved. Why is he just randomly saying, like, oh, by the way, they had this one branch of the government organization invented, and these were their tasks? Like, and he's not even... At one point later, we'll get to it when he talks about how they could fake the data, and he says, oh, it could have been any number of ways. This is one way. That's not what he's doing here. He just says, like, this is what happened. And I don't understand where he's getting this from. And again, I don't think any modern moon landing denier would stand behind this and say, no, this is 100% what happened. But it's just, I don't know, it was just so wild to me when I was reading his book, and then just randomly out of nowhere, he's like, oh, by the way, I have exclusive knowledge of this secret government organization. Let me tell it to you. Just, I don't know. Kaysing bases most of this reconstruction, I guess, off of a DIA org chart. Although we don't actually have the org chart, he is just reproducing it. And so then he puts what the org chart says on one column, and then in the other column puts what he thinks the org chart means. Which again is just him putting stuff together. Like, there's nothing here. There's no evidence. He's just saying, like, this is what happened. But he's not even saying he has a source. He's just saying it. Like, he basically just describes this secret government organization in a ton of detail immediately after saying they had so much security, there's no way anyone who was unauthorized could have possibly gained access. There's 4 more pages of this. And again, that's on the Internet Archive version of this book. Again, if you want to read it, everything's linked in the companion doc. But, like, there's no evidence. He's just saying stuff. I don't mean to ad hom. Well, scratch that, actually. I guess I do mean to ad hom. But just what does it say about the theory when the first guy to seriously propose it, formally propose it, I guess I should say, had ideas this wild with nothing to back them up and presented them right alongside those same ideas? Anyway, chapter 9 is a bit more about how they could have faked it, like the actual technical things. They just give one theory without pointing out actual inconsistencies in the data, saying they could have done it any number of ways. This is just one, which, again, it's not taking a firm position, but on top of that, like, Kaysing's suggestion is sort of insane. Because it's like, well, they build a rocket, and then they have the astronauts get in the rocket, but then they sneak them out of the rocket and take them to a moon landing set, and then they fire the rocket, but the rocket goes, really far away. Because people could tune in on the ham radio, if you had a ham radio, you could tune in to the signal. They had to, like, first set up fake telephone communications so that the NASA operators at the various control sites were getting fed fake data. And then they had to duplicate that fake data with a satellite and broadcast it so that the ham radio operators would get the same duplicated data at the exact same time. And then on top of that, they had to, like, coordinate when the shuttle went behind the dark side of the moon. The signal cut out. And so he was like, oh, and it was so beautifully orchestrated, no one even noticed that it was fake. Which at that point, why not just have everything on the satellite? Why do you need the telephone line? Okay, but this is the difficult thing, because he's not saying this is how they did it. So if I say, well, your thing is weird and doesn't make sense, it's pretty easy for him to just go, oh, well, maybe they could have done it another way. Which, again, is one of my real problems here. It's like, if it was faked, why can't you find evidence within the telemetry data? Why can't you find evidence within that kind of data that it was faked? Why couldn't you necessarily see that they had miscalculated drag, that it had actually been windy that day or something like that? You should be able to look at the data and come up with stuff like this, but you can't. And they don't look at the data like this. And before the people say, oh, it was lost, NASA doesn't have the telemetry data, just for the record, they do, okay? They just don't have the original. They have copies. And again, if you don't believe me, I mean this, but also check my companion document. Chapter 10 just randomly calls Buzz Aldrin mentally ill. I'm being a little unfair. Kaysing is trying to tie the mental illness to stress over having to keep up such a big lie. But he demonstrates this with some of the most out-of-context quotes I've ever seen, including, "My life is unreal," and "I felt all 6 of us were fakes and fools for allowing ourselves to be convinced by some strange concept of duty to be sent." So not even giving the object of the sentence in that one. The quote comes from Buzz Aldrin's autobiography, where he relates a fight he had with his wife in Norway. He had gone there at the request of the king for sort of a diplomatic mission. And what he makes very clear in the passage is that he is already struggling with the lack of control he feels over his life. Which, I mean, sort of makes sense, This guy was just a dude. And now he's one of the biggest celebrities on Earth. And a celebrity that the US government very much paid for. And so they're going to use him on diplomatic missions. They're going to send him out to meet with people in other countries because people in other countries want to meet him, okay? Dennis Rodman is very important to North Korea for a similar reason. Now, as he cancels one of the appearances he's supposed to make, he falls into a deep depression and apparently just doesn't get out of bed. And his wife, Joan, goes to the appearance without him and then comes back and basically just sort of berates him for leaving her alone, which I imagine that must have been a terribly humiliating experience for her. The full quote, starting with him yelling at his wife, is, "Joan, I've been to the moon, and I'm never going to be allowed to live the way I once lived. Neither are you, and neither are our kids. Your belief isn't right.
It's only a hope, and it won't work. Let's just try to make it as worthwhile as we can." We fell into an uneasy silence, which I ended by saying, "I felt all 6 of us were fakes and fools for allowing ourselves to be convinced by some strange concept of duty to be sent through all of these countries for the sake of propaganda. Nothing more, nothing less." Like, again, it's that is deeply personal. It's a big props to Buzz Aldrin for being so vulnerable and honest about that, especially so soon after the moon landing when he was still seen as this, larger than life figure. But it's very clearly about just the change that happens in a person's life when they go from a normal person to a celebrity, how much control they lose over their life, how much freedom they lose. And he's just never going to be able to go back to having a normal life. Again, I don't know, man. I think it's really sad, but I don't see this as like clearly he was lying. Kaysing kind of culminates all this with a moment where Buzz Aldrin supposedly had a nervous breakdown when he was being interviewed in a semi-private setting. Like, he wasn't being interviewed on television, but he was being interviewed by an NBC anchor in front of a crowd. And he asks Buzz Aldrin a question, basically, "Now that 2 years have gone by, can you tell me, how did it really feel to be on the moon?" And Aldrin just says, like, his throat went dry, he got dizzy, and he kind of just had to stumble out of there after signing a couple autographs. I don't know, it just doesn't seem that weird for, like, less than 2 years after becoming that famous. It's still, like, a weird experience. And his whole thing is, he says, "I knew I couldn't give an answer that was satisfactory. I knew all the pilots would laugh at me." But he does give an answer, so it feels more like a nerves thing or something. I don't know. It just feels mean. Like, this just feels like, honestly, like someone's very vulnerable and you use it against them to push a stupid conspiracy. I don't know. This part, I think, is a little gross. Kaysing ends the chapter by saying he once spoke to a specialist in human communication, so kind of vague there. And that this specialist said that what probably happened, I'm just going to quote it. He said that probably Aldrin's hypnotic state, imposed as a part of the moon trip simulation, was finally terminated by that one critical question, asked at a crucial time. So I guess the astronauts were also under hypnosis, even though they were in on it and getting paid off. Sorry, I feel like I shouldn't be this dismissive. I should engage a bit more with the material, but it's like, it's just difficult when it's like, oh wow, this guy had mental illness. Betcha it was mind control. It's like, I don't know, man. If men can get sad, it can be tough to be famous. These are real things. Like, and it seems really weird to like hyperfixate on a nervous breakdown and then say, if he'd been telling the truth, then his mental health would have been fine. Like, I don't know. Chapter 11 claims it was all about money, people lining their pockets. Again, there's no evidence for this because something else that you run into with these kinds of assertions is, if the moon landing was fake, then the money thing makes sense. But the problem is, the money thing is used as evidence that it was fake. It's like, look, it was 30 billion. That's so much money. Like, we could have used this money for other stuff. Why do we use it on this thing that didn't work? Now, Kaysing himself saw many of these tests take place. Again, he worked at a rocket test site. So obviously there was some spending. It's tough to deal with this stuff because it only makes sense if it was fake. And so then the problem is you're stuck dealing with something that is predicated on the crux of the argument. So it's like, I don't know, man. Look, if it was fake, they embezzled money. How about that? I'll give you that one. The problem is when you run a lot of this down and try and form a positive position, you end up with this incredibly narrow scope, which is then easy for moon landing people to deal with because they can just say, oh, well, that's not what we're saying. So it's a bit of a catch-22, honestly. And again, I think the easier way to do it is to make them state the positive and attack it from there. And if they refuse to, then it's much easier all of a sudden. But again, I digress. In the last chapter, chapter 12, Kaysing actually caught me completely off guard. Because he just randomly pivots to attacking capitalism. It's genuinely like, maybe the real hoax was capitalism all along. It just gave me so much whiplash. I was like, wait, what? He basically talks about how he hated working a 9-to-5, which obviously was working at Rocketdyne. And then, he was so much happier when he retired. With the money that he made at Rocketdyne, obviously. And then he shills a list of books to help you not have to work a 9-to-5. And that's it. the book is over. Like, I almost wonder if he intentionally did this as a misdirection, because again, it was just so out of left field to me. You know, to be fair, Kaysing never says that the Soviets weren't able to make it to the moon with their unmanned probe, so I wonder if he would believe in that.
Was Bill Kaysing actually a Soviet spy sent to sow discord amongst Americans?
Again, like, you can say that I'm mocking him, because I am very much, but it's like, I don't know, man, it's fun to just ask questions then run away. And it's like pretty clear what I'm implying. I don't believe it, obviously. I'm very much doing it intentionally in bad faith. Definitionally in bad faith. But I don't know. Like, this is kind of what I'm trying to point out, though. This is both the power and the weakness of JAQing it. Because ultimately, everyone knows the argument I'm making. Anyway, that's Kaysing's book. Or, well, the text of it, anyway. But before we go, we gotta do the photos. So actually, let me do a little live set change here. Let's see about this, huh? That's cool, right? I feel like that works. So first we have several claims like this, that these photos are either edited or could be recreated quite easily on Earth. For this first one, it's incredibly easy. Kaysing himself included the caption about the photo being of a crater. Beyond the lip of a crater, the other side's gonna look very different. And if it's out of focus, it's gonna look a lot smoother than the side near you. So it feels a little odd to be like, look how obviously edited it is, when it's like, you're taking the photo of like a crater with like the, edge here and the rest of it on the other side. So I don't know. My favorite though has to be this one, which states exposure to the sun on the moon produces the temperatures of molten lead plus. In the shadow, temperatures go to absolute zero. No indication of this extreme contrast is shown in this picture, which has several things wrong with it. When you talk about something like the shadow of the sun and how cold it can get, the same thing happens on Earth. It is much warmer during the daytime when the sun is warming things. And then at night, when the sun is gone, the heat dissipates because there isn't a source to provide that heat. But obviously that's not immediate. In the same way that if you turn off a hot stove, it doesn't immediately get cool. Secondly, how exactly would that temperature change be shown visually? I don't know if he's expecting like icicles on some and steam or the other. Like, I don't know, maybe I'm being unfair, but when I first saw this, I was kind of thinking like, how would you even look at the difference in temperature there? Finally, those temps are way off. The boiling point of lead is like 330 degrees Celsius, 620-ish Fahrenheit. Whereas the portion of the moon that gets direct sunlight only experiences temperatures of like 120 degrees Celsius, which is 252-ish Fahrenheit. Still very hot, more than double the hottest recorded temperature on the surface of Earth, but not outside the realm of what we can already protect against. And again, not even half the temperature of the melting point of lead. He then goes through the steps of rocketry, which we covered briefly. Remember, it had my favorite, "Doesn't this all seem a bit complicated?" quote. Most of this is just high-quality JAQ material, such as when he says, "Rolling a 7 9 times in a row is improbable, so is this," which I assume he's referring to rolling a 7 in the game 1995 game Settlers of Catan, or Craps, one of the two, I'm not sure. But if we put the dice in the hands of a robot who knows exactly how to throw the dice, how fast they'll spin and what the environment is, and it knows the exact orientation of the dice when we put it in the robot's hands, suddenly it feels a lot less like chance and a lot more like cheating. That's it for most of the moon photos. The last one is going to be this picture of the Nevada desert hills, which Kaysing says is very similar to the surface of the moon, which Armstrong himself actually very famously noted as well. But I will also point out that both the Nevada desert and the moon get an awful lot of sunlight and not a lot of water. So it's not strange that they'd have kind of similar topography. So there you go. Kaysing's book debunked in minute detail. But like I said, Kaysing was very much the birth of JAQing it. And as a result, he hadn't refined his technique quite yet. He proposed a lot of questions, but he also offered some theories. However, for the most part, the thing that he was focused on was just sort of casting doubt, bringing up perceived inconsistencies, without necessarily a firm theory as to what happened on the back end. And while his book and theory didn't move a ton of people, it certainly did move some.
By the 90s, I can find evidence that at least 9% of Americans thought the moon landing might have been faked, up from, again, maybe 5% in 1969. And that's basically where things would stay for the next 25 years. However, in 2001, something happened which would completely shake up the conspiracy theory community. Okay, well, two things, I guess, technically. But the one I'm talking about happened in February. It was Fox aired a special called Conspiracy Theory, Did We Land on the Moon? That's the one I'm talking about, not the other one. One interesting aside that I feel like doesn't really fit into the video, so I'm gonna just put it in the companion doc for the most part. The creators of this film have all really distanced themselves from it. So the special was directed by John Moffat. Funnily enough, after this, he'd go on to become a producer and then a supervising producer for the show The Amazing Race, and would actually win 3 Primetime Emmys, I believe it was. But if you ever look him up on podcasts he's done or bios on like the Emmys website, you'll notice he often leaves the moon landing thing out of his bio.
Does this mean he no longer stands behind the special? Does this mean it was just a lie and an obvious cash grab?
Interesting aside, again, check the companion doc if you want to see more about that. So the special relied heavily on updated versions of Kaysing's argument, and featured Kaysing in it himself. He's introduced as an analyst and engineer at Rocketdyne.
Bill Kaysing was an analyst and engineer at Rocketdyne, the company that designed the Apollo rocket.
Even though he was never either of those things. And the only reason you'd even do something like that would be to lend their words more credibility than they'd have otherwise.
Why did they feel the need to add titles, to add credibility to what these people were saying? Was what they were saying not credible to begin with?
That is a lot more fun than I thought it was going to be, actually, when I wrote it in the script. Just as a reminder, according to Fox, this special shifted Skepticism, the moon landing, up to, in some cases I've seen as high as 20%, although I think 15 is a bit more reasonable. Even modern polling shows it on the high end at 11% and on the low end 9%. So we're very much in an age where this specific conspiracy is a lot more popular than it used to be. You're gonna find a lot of stuff in the special that comes from Kaysing. What about the dust? Where are the stars? It looks like the desert. Again, we just covered all this stuff when we talked about Kaysing, and it's basically just a rehash of his ideas, so we're only gonna cover the new points the special brings up, things that weren't present in Kaysing's book. The earliest new claim is that the moonlander itself was unstable, showing this footage of Armstrong crashing it. Although, if you notice, the design's a little different because obviously he didn't crash the lander, he crashed a prototype, one that they'd obviously modify and change. And also it was being tested on Earth, with Earth's gravity and atmosphere. So, a little bit more to fight against than in the near vacuum of the moon. As much as one skeptic, credited for some reason as an author/scientist, I guess just a generalist, but again, they miscredit a lot of people in this documentary, claims
Webb had a single engine mounted dead center, and then they had little push jets, thruster jets, a couple of them up on top. This was supposed to control their attitude as they came down. Well, I'll tell you a secret. The instant you moved your tail in that cabin an inch, you would change the load pattern, it would begin to tilt, and it would start that thing spinning.
NASA specifically wanted the LEM to be lightweight. And the rotation and spin was actually an important and planned part of the descent. They weren't gonna fly to the moon backwards or sideways, after all. Again, failure is part of the scientific method. We include a whole step for it. You make a hypothesis and then you test that hypothesis. And if that hypothesis fails, you update it. Same thing works in mechanical engineering. You have an idea, you think, well, let me design this system, see if it works. And then if it doesn't, you change it and you update it and you fix it. The next one, to me, was a bit of a bait and switch. They're talking about footprints, which to me, I thought they were going to talk about those whole thing where the footprints don't match, which they do. You're looking at the wrong suit, but no, that's actually not what it is. Kaysing claims
to have a powerful rocket engine blast the surface of the moon, blasting away all of the dust, and then find footprints surrounding the lunar lander. That to me would be an impossibility.
Which, like, is the assumption the footprints would have been made before landing? Like, why would the ascent affect the footprints as opposed to the descent? This is honestly one of the few I might be completely misinterpreting, because
it's possibly meant from the later Ascent stage, but these photos are from before the Ascent stage. And B, you can see the Ascent here. The force is concentrated in the part of the lander that's going back into orbit. So I have no idea. So I do love this one guy who, when talking about the landing site, you know, why isn't there disturbance? Why isn't there a blast crater? Why isn't the soil burned? Just very calmly explains
the amount of thrust that you need coming out of the bottom of the descent engine is about 1,500, 2,000 pounds of thrust. And all that does is just push dust away. There's no burning or anything like that.
And the special just goes.
Yet NASA's own scientific illustrations clearly depict a blast crater.
And then just moves on. By the way, that's actually a cropped photo. In the full version of the photo, you can see the rocket is for the ascent. It's not for the descent. So when they're saying there was no rocket, they're right. Speaking of, the next part is...
In the footage of the ascent stage going up, what you don't see is an exhaust plume coming out of the rocket engine nozzle.
Again, if you're talking about a very low gravity environment and you focus, you know, all the stuff at the bottom, and then it just goes poosh and takes off really quickly because it's an instantaneous blast. You know, there isn't much more additional force to keep it accelerating. And you wouldn't need that force because obviously you're not fighting against, you know, Earth gravity necessarily.
We see the ascent stage suddenly pop up without any exhaust plume whatsoever, as though it were jerked up by a cable.
Which, yes, when you don't have gravity and you apply force, you know, instantaneously for just a second, it's going to accelerate very rapidly, and then it's going to achieve a stable velocity until an outside force acts upon it. That's just how inertia works, which is, yeah, remarkably similar to what it would be like if you were able to pull a string at a constant speed. I feel like there's a way you can jack that, of like pulling with a string wouldn't look like that, because again, whenever you pull with the string, there has to be, the string's going to go taut first, and then it's going to match. So it actually should jump up slightly and then fall back to settle. So given that it actually is that smooth of a motion, I don't think it could have been a string. Wait, sorry. I also just realized I missed a great opportunity. One, hold on. But if it was a string on Earth, how did they keep it so contained? How high would they have had to lift it? They then claim that if you speed the footage up, it looks like it was on Earth. It doesn't look like it involves lower gravity.
Percy notes that when the speed of the film is doubled, the astronauts appear to be running as if in Earth's gravity. Also, when the footage of the lunar rover is doubled in speed, it looks as if it's driving here on Earth.
Note here, when they walk, if you speed it up, it actually doesn't look like they're on Earth. For one very simple reason: the weight. Notice too, the gap that appears occasionally. They're not going step, 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 step. They're going jump, 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 jump. People can't really walk that way. You can't walk with a gap of air like that. Similarly, for the rover, the footage is too smooth. When the tires are spinning, notice how it's not throwing dust. The dust just kind of spreads out in a circle. In fact, look at the soil on the tires being flung out when it gets sped up. That looks way too fast. But if you just kind of look at the vague overall image, it does kind of make sense. You have to look at the details, though. Does that remotely look like how sand flies off a tire in the desert? Or the speed at which the sand would fly off said tire? They then move on to...
If the cameras were so difficult to manipulate, how were thousands of photos taken with crystal clarity and precise framing?
The pictures that we see that allegedly were taken on the moon are absolutely perfect.
A lot of them don't. A lot of them have very bad framing. Some of them are cool, even with the bad framing, because... I mean, one rule you learn in any kind of filmmaking idea is sometimes following the rules isn't the best thing to do. Sometimes a bad frame is more interesting than a good frame. So when they say, you know, how are these photos so well framed if they didn't have a viewfinder? You know, how are they so well staged? Probably because you're not seeing the billion bad photos. Like that's, I don't know, man, that's just how it works. You don't see the bad takes. Again, I'm telling you, I'm on hour 7. How long is this video at this point? I guarantee it's not 7 hours. So now we get to another famous one. Shadows.
In this photograph from Apollo 14, the shadows are cast in different directions, suggesting multiple light sources.
And now, for the first time in this entire history of this channel, I get to do something. I get to take a total break from my formula.
because I actually have extensive professional experience with this, about a decade working in entertainment. So I'm excited. Can you tell I'm excited? I feel for the first time I actually do get to say I'm an expert, and you have to listen to me on this. For those of you who don't know, prior to starting this channel, and actually still to this day, YouTube isn't my full-time job or anything yet, I worked in entertainment, what was known as a technical director. This is someone who works in live or live tape or as live or certain talk set. Anyway, there's a couple settings, but it's highly specific. I operate a specific piece of equipment known as a video switcher. Essentially, it is the thing that if you're watching a sporting event and it cuts from the wide shot of the field to a close-up of a player's face, someone is hitting a button to make that happen, and that person is me. When you're shooting something on a set, especially with multiple light sources, you are constantly thinking about shadows. Now, 90% of the time, the claims of the shadows not lining up either come from not really looking at the photos or not understanding what's going on in them. Though I will also say, this was one of the parts where I felt more crazy than anything else researching for this video, because this is one where I actually think all the people trying to prove the moon landing happened also get it wrong. Usually people trying to prove it happened will point to the fact that you can have shadows going off in different angles from a single light source. In fact, here's a photo I took at sunset. Notice the sun is the only light source in this image, and the shadows of the banister, which I can guarantee you are parallel, go off at slightly different angles. But it just doesn't feel right, especially when you look at a photo like this. I mean, those shadows don't look remotely parallel. How do you account for that much of a swing? And the answer is actually far more simple than differing perspectives. All the shadows are parallel. Every single one. At least in the photos that I saw, anyway. Now, I can't go through every single photo because there's just too many, although that would be a fun video, actually, if someone could get like a giant repository of all these different, the shadows don't line up. That might be fun, actually. That might be fun. But instead, I'm just going to explain the photos that I encountered both in my research and in the works that I'm referencing. Although, there's really only 2 explanations for basically every single one of them. So take a look at this famous one from the Fox special. Now, again, just like with the sped up and slowed down footage thing, I'm not going to ask you to look at the shadows themselves. Instead, I want you to look at the objects in the frame and how they're lit. Notice how the parts of both of them that are hit by light are actually the exact same part. And that seems so weird. Why would the unlit side of the lander match the unlit side of the rocks when the lander's shadow is going off in such a completely different direction? So take all of this together and assume that the direction of the shadow coming off the lander is the edge of where the light is hitting, and the shadow should, I'm using air quotes here, be going back in the same direction as the rocks. But so why isn't it then? It's actually simple. There's a hill there. In fact, you can see the hill in the photo. Take a look at this edge of the lander's shadow. Notice how the top part is relatively straight, but the lower side bends in a bit. That doesn't make any sense. In fact, that's not the shape of the lander at all. The top of the lander is flat, so why does the shadow come to a point? More than likely, there's just some hill between the photographer and the lander's shadow that's obscuring a part of the lander. In fact, if you zoom in really close on the struts of the lander's feet, you'll notice those shadows do go in the right direction. Those shadows go in the direction of the rock and not the rest of the shadow that we see on the ground. Which, for the record, you can even see from this photo. Apollo 14 landed on uneven ground, and as a result, the lander wasn't perfectly level with the surface of the moon. It had a lean to it. However, even ignoring how the lean would affect the photo, you can clearly see how uneven the ground is. Note this small hill on this side of the lander's shadow, which, if you were taking a photo from a distance, would probably obscure that half of the shadow. But again, if you compare the dark spot of the lander to the dark spot on the rocks, those are parallel. So now you're going to have to assume they darkened the photos, but kept the shadows the same way. Again, you're always stuck with this place of they fixed one of the problems, but didn't notice the far more glaring one. Because again, everyone noticed the shadows weren't parallel. I don't think a lot of people noticed those dark spots. I've yet to see a single person online point this out. This was one of the ones that made me feel the most crazy, because there are a lot of experiments where people set up to show, look, the shadows can go in different directions, but I don't know that anyone just looked at the lander and said, why is there a giant dark patch on the lander? If the shadow was going in the direction the conspiracists claim it's going, shouldn't this much of the lander also be in light? But if you want to say the hill thing's wrong or doesn't make sense, Well, now you're stuck explaining why the shadow shoots out in that direction without dealing with what part of the lander is actually dark. And again, these are the photos from the Fox special. These are the photos SIbrel himself has used. So if you want to claim NASA realized that and fixed it, why would they fix the part of the lander that's in light and not the shadow that's on the ground? Now ignore the lander and just look at the rocks. Notice their shadows are clearly parallel, but the rock on the left seems like it has more surface in shadow. That likely has far more to do with the shape of the rock, which is the second reason a lot of shadows don't look parallel. Rocks have weird shapes sometimes, and light can hit them in odd ways, creating weird optical illusions. Now let's check one of the most famous, this one. Notice how all the shadows are converging to a single point? How is that remotely possible with a single light source? Well, before I give the answer, let me ask you a different question. Why aren't there two shadows? I mean, look at this rock and this rock. The shadows are obviously going off in different directions, but if we assume each had a single light on it, why aren't there two shadows? Now, maybe they perfectly barn doored it so that those two lights didn't bleed onto each other at all. This is something very possible that very good lighting designers are certainly capable of doing. But in that case, why wouldn't they have thought of the shadows to begin with? I guarantee you, a lighting designer would have thought of those shadows. And on top of that, at that point, why not just light with a single light? Why give each rock its own spotlight? It's going to be far more difficult for a lighting designer to do something like that with no luminance bleed to make it look evenly lit as if it was lit from a single lighting source, plus all the reflections of the ground and the astronaut and whatnot. But we can also reuse our evidence from the first photo that we looked at. Don't look at the shadows, instead look at the rocks. Notice how every rock is lit on the same side, the side the camera is capturing. Now, yes, the camera is only going to be able to capture the side of the rock facing the camera, and it is possible, if the sun was very high overhead, that it could be hitting more than half of the rock, the part of the rock that's exposed up anyway. But we can tell from the angle of the astronaut's shadow that shouldn't be the case, which means only half of the rock should really be lit. So if all of them are lit in the same manner, why aren't their shadows moving in the same direction? In fact, look at this rock. Look at the angle of the shadow. If the angle of the shadow was reflected on what part of the rock was being lit, why isn't there a little dark patch right here that the camera would capture? Simple. There's a divot there. The ground slopes down to a point. Maybe it's a hole, maybe it's just a little funnel or something like that, crater, I have no idea. But pretty clearly, the ground all slopes inwards. Like, look at the shape of this rock. It's rather low and flat, right? But the shadow makes it look like the left side of the rock is way bigger than the right side. That doesn't make any kind of sense unless you assume the slope of the ground under the left side of the rock is much steeper than the slope of the ground on the right side of the rock. So why do all the rock shadows go to a single point? Because the ground goes to a single point, warping the direction the shadows are going, making them all point towards the center of the hole. Now I'm going to jump to another one quickly because this is another one of the ones you'll see a lot. Also, just because I didn't realize I didn't point this out, this photo is from SIbrel's documentary, which we're going to get to in a little bit. And you'll notice you don't see the objects at all in these photos. You only see the shadow. Also, I didn't notice this until post, but SIbrel flipped the photo. I don't know why. Not a huge deal. Honestly, doesn't change his point about shadows. It's not like he messed with those. But if I go between the two, I know I'll get comments. So yeah, he flipped it. I don't know why. Actually, second update. So SIbrel also messed with the aspect ratio of this image. And I'm pretty sure he flipped it to hide that fact. Like here, right now on screen, I'm going to overlay these two images. Notice how they don't quite line up? Now, if I mess with the aspect ratio of NASA's version of the image, now they line up perfectly. So he flipped it and messed with the aspect ratio. In fact, you can tell who edited the photos, NASA or SIbrel, by looking at the crosshairs. In NASA's photos, all the crosshairs are 1:1. The top line and the bottom line are the same length. Whereas in SIbrel's stretched version of the photo, you can clearly see the horizontal line is longer than the vertical line. Now, why would he do that? Because the angle of the shadows in the original image isn't as severe as SIbrel wanted them to be. Like, there still is a discrepancy. You can see in the original image, it still doesn't look like they're parallel, and I'll go back into my footage where I explain what actually happened there. But this is when I was like, SIbrel was going out of his way to be dishonest,
to make a better case than what was originally there.
I honestly wish I'd caught this earlier. I would have made way more of a stink about SIbrel. Now I'm forced, like, kind of recording this thing that I have to cobble together a little bit in post. If you recall, my channel started from this. My channel started from me being really upset over one guy being super dishonest. I would have had a field day tearing this guy apart, but past is past. So I'm going off the original aspect ratio for this, but there is still an explanation for why these shadows don't line up as much. So fortunately for us, Aldrin took a ton of photos, and often these astronauts would take a panorama, where they basically would just, take a photo turn, take a photo turn, take a photo turn, so on and so forth. So as a result, we can actually see the entire area, including that shadow, in multiple photos. Actually, as you can see, NASA's panorama also stretches a few things. So I've made my own version on the top from images available on the NASA website. I cropped the images, but importantly, did not mess with the aspect ratio. You can check the companion doc if you want more details on that. We can tell the shadow came from this specific device, which you can clearly see that the antenna runs up and down, so the shadow should be straight. However, you can clearly see from the reconstruction the shadow's on a hill. Aldrin's shadow, though, doesn't fall on that hill. In fact, it doesn't fall on either of those sheer surfaces. It actually falls on a funnel between two of the hills, a little kind of valley thing going on. So the shadow curves, Aldrin's shadow doesn't, and in the panorama, you can even see why that's the case and see it so clearly. As far as I can tell, Fox never manipulated their photos beyond brightness and contrast, which, to be fair, may have been due to the quality of scans they had access to, and also might have been a result of how they had to encode the video for broadcast. So I'm inclined to give them a pass on that. Like I said, there are a million shadow photos. We just don't have time to go through them all. But those rules should basically be able to deal with anything you come up with. Look at the shape of the ground, look at the parts of the objects that are actually lit. Although, again, I'm going to say what is going to be the most frustrating part of this to me is this won't matter that much to the skeptics, because disproving one or two photos and saying, oh no, the shadows do line up here, and the shadows do line up here, they're going to say, okay, well, forget those photos. What about this other photo? What about this other photo? What about this other photo? Which is just... like, you can go through every single photo, but for them it's like, as long as one photo the shadows don't line up, clearly that means that it was fake. Whereas disproving so many of the photos they claim show that the shadows don't line up does nothing for them. The fact that you're going to hold up these photos and say they show this, and then I can show the photos don't show that, that should affect how strongly you believe the evidence points to what you think it points to. It should. This is what I'm going to find the hardest to explain. They're interviewing someone who they say designed the camera. And they interview him and be like, look, you designed this camera. Here's a photo of this guy. How is he lit? And he's, well, I'll just play the clip.
In this picture, the sun is directly behind the astronaut. His figure should be a silhouette.
It seems like he's standing in the spotlight. And I can't explain that. That escapes me. Why?
I don't know why he wouldn't be able to explain that. It's very obviously the bounce effect. You can even see how blown out the rest of the photo is. Like, it's pretty obvious. If you zoom in on his helmet, you can see how bright the astronaut is. So obviously that astronaut is reflecting a ton of light towards him because it's hitting his helmet. I don't know why the guy didn't know that. That's weird to me. That is the part I have the hardest time explaining, why a camera guy couldn't explain this. Again, if you doubt what I'm saying about any of these photos, every single one is linked, both the NASA originals and the timestamps from the SIbrel and the Fox special that I got them from, and the Kaysing book where appropriate, although for the most part, he doesn't mention shadows that much. So the next part has to do with identical backgrounds.
These two photos seem to have the same mountain backdrop, yet the lunar module is only present in one of them. Seemingly impossible, since the LEM never moved and its base remained even after the mission.
Now this is actually one of the more convincing pieces of evidence out there, because the claim is, they're using the same background. The ridges line up really closely. Not exactly, which is what most debunkers say, is that it's not an exact match, but they're really, really close. But what was more important than that to me was the spots. If you look in the hill up in the corner, you can see those spots basically match between the two of them, which really does make it seem like it's the same ridge. which makes sense because it is the same ridge. NASA themselves have literally pointed out they're the exact same mountain ranges. When you go look at photos like this, you can actually find a transcript that NASA has. The transcript of basically all the communications from the lunar mission, and they even have lined up video footage and photos. So we know that the first photo was taken from what they refer to as Station 8, which, just for the record, it's not a real station, there's nothing there, just that's where they go, so they refer to it that way. And then this is from Station 9, which you can see on a map are here and here. So if the directions are to be believed, that would make the background of these images the Swan Range of the Apennine Mountains, the ones on the moon. In fact, even easier, both photos are actually part of larger panoramas, and therefore we can see each is flanked by both Mount Hadley and the Silver Spur, which, from NASA's own mapping of the moon, are located here and here, meaning this would be the angle of the photos. Makes perfect sense how they could have gotten two different shots, one with the lander in it and one with the lander not in it, because the camera guy moved, but the background didn't. And again, you don't have to take my word for this. You can actually prove this. You'll notice if you overlay the two ridges on top of one another, there's slight differences in where the ridges line up. There's some slight parallaxing happening there. Although, I will say, I do get very disappointed at some people who try to prove the moon landing was real, because a lot of times what they do is they say, look, the ridges aren't exactly identical. There's small differences, but it's like, they're the same ridge. NASA also says they're the same ridge. I honestly think stuff like this is some of what allows moon landing denial to flourish. If you're gonna go and try and prove the moon landing happened, you're gonna start with the assumption that the moon landing happened, and all the evidence that you're gonna find, you're gonna make support that in the exact same way the deniers do. I feel like this is a much bigger problem when you run into stuff like this, where I see plenty of people online line up the photos and go, oh look, they're not identical. Okay, well, they must be different ridges, so moving on. Because obviously I did the same thing. I overlaid them and saw, oh look, they don't quite line up. But I knew that wasn't enough to move on because the spots drove me crazy. Which then, if any moon landing denier looks into it, they're gonna find that they are the same ridge, and that's just gonna feed things. Like, sometimes the moon landing deniers make good points. Sometimes they're right about specific things that they're pointing out, but that doesn't mean that they're right about their overall claim. And I think sometimes some of the problem is assuming they have to be wrong on every single thing that they bring up kind of means that you run into the problem of saying, well, because they have to be wrong, I need to start with that assumption and then look at the evidence from there. But I digress. Moving on. Oh, our next one is actually another same thing used twice idea.
This tape was shot on what was reported to be the first of Apollo 16's lunar excursions.
But it couldn't pick a better spot.
And this video was from the next day at a different location.
Even though, according to NASA's official logs, the astronauts were in vastly different locations on both of those days. First off, this one actually took me like forever to track down, and is a great example of how annoying JAQing is, because the answer to this one is gonna be something that will be very, very satisfying to everyone who believes the moon landing happened, and will be deeply unsatisfying to everyone who believes it didn't. And it's funny, I already, because I've disproved so much, feel very comfortable just starting with, okay, it doesn't matter if the shots were reused, that doesn't mean anything. The only thing that matters was, were they shot on the moon? But again, we'll get into it, I'm not just gonna leave it with that. So this footage is from Cinco Crater near Stone Mountain, which Apollo 16 visited on their second day of moonwalking. I further managed to track both clips down. Note, the first appears in a video clip that NASA mentions in their log at 1:44:48:26. 46:28. Barring travel, because they didn't do video while they were, driving around in the rover, obviously, you can actually see video of what they were doing pretty much every time they stopped the rover and started setting up. Because again, NASA was watching. The clips were used in a documentary called Nothing So Hidden, which the irony of the title heavily depends on whether or not you believe the moon landing was faked. This shot is used in an establishing sequence for when they talk about the activities they did with the first moonwalk, and then this shot is used to end the second day of moonwalks. Now in documentaries, things like this happen all the time. In fact, if you've ever seen any reality show where they're like eating and drinking, pay attention to the level of liquid in their cups.
I've been wanting to ask you this for a long time, so I'm sorry if it seems like rude, but he just have so many questions, so now I have to ask the question. So, I'd like to ask you, why did you break up? Why did the two of you break up?
Why are you asking her now?
You can ask him anything you want. He give you advice. It's only fair.
You'll notice that the levels of those drinks won't be consistent, even though the conversation sounds like it's flowing very naturally. And this is because the editors basically edited the conversation to be a bit more interesting than what might have actually happened, you know, there on the day at the moment. However, it'd be really weird to look at that and then say that no conversation happened at all. This is just the case of a documentarian using footage to fill time. I would call it showmanship, but if you want to call it dishonest, that's still accurate. Showmanship to a certain extent is dishonesty, but you can't use it as evidence that the totality of the moon landing was faked just because one documentarian happened to do something a little dishonest. In fact, if you want, I have strung together all of the footage from Stone Mountain, and I have it here in my companion document in an unlisted, unmonetized YouTube video, so you can go watch those 10 minutes for yourself if you want. And again, if you want to take the time to go through the NASA archives, again, also linked in my companion document, you can look at all the footage yourself and basically see unedited, uninterrupted footage of them on the ground when they're not in the rover. Although for some reason it's always in like 3-minute chunks, so you do have to string them together. But when you string them together, you'll see there is no cut, there's no edit. It just seamlessly flows into the next one. So, but again, this is the strength of JAQing it, because there's a really easy response to this of why did they need to add the footage at all? If they had footage from day one, why did they feel the need to use footage from day two? It's actually really similar to Kaysing's absolute kill shot when Buzz Aldrin says, "I want it to be as honest as possible," and Kaysing says, "Why not just plain honest?" Like, it's a dumb semantic game that isn't really meant to prove anything. Again, it's just meant to kind of cast doubt on the whole thing. And what I don't like about it is it's only going to flow in one direction. Because if I were to say, you know, why did SIbrel use
Why does SIbrel show non-Apollo rocket failures in his film? Could it be that he couldn't find enough footage of Apollo rockets failing to fit his narrative?
No skeptic is going to say, that's a good point. Maybe we shouldn't trust anything else SIbrel has to say. But again, the doubt only flows in one direction, so moving on.
Shouldn't the fact the conspiracists were wrong this many times in a row mean that we should be skeptical of the rest of their supposed inconsistencies?
Anyway, though, the crosshairs are even on the Wikipedia page. They're a lot less popular these days, too, because again, they've been debunked a few times.
Crosshairs were permanently etched into the lunar cameras, so they would have to appear on top of every image. But in this photo, a crosshair is behind a part of the lunar rover.
And it's exactly what I was expecting when I came across this. So the crosshairs are actually carved onto the back plates of the cameras the astronauts were using. So they should be on top of everything. When they fade out, though, really all it is just, again, you're overexposing it, so that little small black line gets lost in all the white around it. Bloom in video games, if you're familiar with that. It's basically that sort of an effect. If you look at less developed versions of the photos, you can actually still see the crosshairs. And that also makes sense why, when you look at the American flag, it's only covered by the white parts of the flag, not the red parts of the flag. Which again, if you want to take the conspiracy perspective, then you're going to have to say, oh, well, they remembered to put the crosshair in front of the red parts of the flag, but then they forgot to put the crosshair in front of the white parts of the flag. Again, like I said, a big part of the problem that I have with so many of these conspiracy theories is if you apply their own logic backwards, like, they get into trouble really quickly. But anyway. They next talk about the Van Allen radiation belt, which is very important to moon landing deniers. But in my opinion, SIbrel actually makes the strongest case for that, so we'll cover that when we deal with his film. The special ends by saying,
in 2 years, Japan will send an orbiter to take close-up photos of the moon's surface. What will they find? Until then, the question remains, did we land on the moon?
Which, by the way, yes, we do have non-American evidence, from probes sent to the moon that took photos of Apollo mission sites. But again, for the moon landing people, everything's fake. The Chinese government's in on it, Japanese government's in on it, every government is in on it, so who cares? Now this special, in my opinion, really is what stepped JAQing up to the next level, because it didn't present itself as the moon landing is clearly fake, and it didn't make Kaysing's mistake of trying to take a firm, solid position. Instead, it presented a model I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with. It said, hey, we're just presenting all the evidence, and you can make up your own mind. Again, we're just asking questions. Part of the reason I think this special is so much more JAQy than Kaysing's book is because that's kind of just how TV works. When you're in the booth, you're often sitting very close to the EP or the showrunner or the head writer, whatever they're calling themselves on this project. And you're going to overhear a lot of the chatter they're going to have with some of their producers. So naturally, you're going to pick up to a certain extent on what they're trying to achieve, what they think is important, what they think is not important, and those types of things. And one thing that basically everyone in the booth is thinking about is, how do you keep people watching?
If the lunar module landed with 10,000 pounds of thrust, why is there no blast crater? Plus, was this footprint really made on the moon? And later, 10 astronauts die under strange circumstances. How far could the conspiracy reach?
If I were to end it with, tune in next week, I assume a lot of you would completely understand what the intended effect of those questions is. Due to the nature of just trying to keep people watching, it didn't feel weird to the viewer to constantly ask questions and then end with questions still remain. When Moffat's experience in TV combined with Kaysing's natural inclination to JAQ it, you ended up with something really special. A conspiracy theory that didn't actually require any belief, only doubt. The theory had now shifted from having to provide any positive claims about what did happen, and instead to only focus on casting doubt on the official narrative. In fact, there's plenty of moon landing deniers to this day that say, I don't know what happened, they need to tell us. Maybe it was this, maybe it was that. They need to be honest with us. Which is always funny to me, because it's like, I don't know why you'd expect them to be honest the second time, but hey, that's just me. Doubt is one thing. It's strong, it's very, very strong, but it's ultimately negative. It's not something that you actually can point to as evidence. For example, there's no photos of the astronauts, sipping coffee on the moon landing set, stuff like that. A Bigfoot photo or a photo of the Loch Ness Monster goes a lot further in people's minds than just saying, this photo isn't what it claims to be. However, if you can get footage of people trying to shut you down, saying that you shouldn't be talking about this stuff, isn't that a type of evidence? Enter the third character in our story, Bart SIbrel. Now, if Bart ever sees this, he may find the next section a little unfair to him, and frankly, that's probably correct. He's in that special, the Fox special we were just talking about. Not nearly as much as Kaysing, but he is in there.
But investigative journalist Bart SIbrel believes that NASA intentionally made the images hard to see.
And he'd been an active moon landing denier earlier than the Fox special. As a matter of fact, his first film on it, Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, came out in January of 2001, so a full month before the special would actually air in February. 2001 was a really big year for conspiracy theories. But unlike with Kaysing and the Fox special, Bart isn't part of this story because of how he denies the moon landing. Bart is part of this story because Buzz Aldrin punched him in the face.
You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself. Away from me. You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
Due to the popularity he got from this, SIbrel would continue to pull these kinds of stunts, including one where he claimed to be shooting a documentary for the History Channel and got in front of Edgar Mitchell of Apollo 14 to swear on a Bible that he'd been to the moon. Mitchell did this, but then SIbrel said that he was an atheist, so it didn't count.
I don't believe in that, but if you have eternal damnation.
Which, as much as I get what you're saying there, why didn't you plan for that? I'm Catholic, all right? Like, I hold faith that I'm sure a lot of people in this country don't necessarily hold, but I don't assume everyone else is Catholic, dude. Anyway, supposedly as he drove away, he forgot to take off Mitchell's mic, and it captured this hot mic moment of his son asking Mitchell, "Want to call the CIA? Have him whacked?" Anyone who's ever done anything with live, and for the record, I was video, gear, whatever. I dealt more with the video side of things, okay? I was not audio. Audio is very much always their own department. If anything, I'd say I have a better knowledge of graphics than I do audio. But anyone who has ever been remotely around any kind of production environment involving lavalier mics will tell you, they are the most finicky, annoying to get working things in the entire world. So if you're genuinely going to tell me that you had the receiver in the backseat of your car and the son went back into the house before you even left, which is also strange. Like, the dad said leave, watched you get into your car, and then went back in his house. Like, he seems to be very upset with you. He seems to be very kind of threatening and imposing. Why would he go back in the house? And then you keep rolling, but you don't turn on the car to leave. You just sit in the driveway. And while you're sitting in the driveway, the son says, do you want to call the CIA and, you know, have this guy whacked? With the receiver going through the back seat of your car, through the wall of their house. It's just like, this was in 2004, I think it was. They just weren't that good. There's no way you would have been able to pick that up so clearly. And I think another thing that's weird is, again, this is just something I always think of as someone in production. What did you cut out? There obviously was something that was said before that, something that was said after that. Unless your genuine claim is you got in the car, they ran back in the house as quickly as humanly possible, and then you cut. Like, why only include that? Why not include whatever led him to make that comment? Anyway, sorry. Oh, wait, sorry. What kind of context would you be worried we'd encounter if we could hear the rest of the tape? That's good. I honestly, because I'm just kind of ad-libbing, I didn't even have this in the script. That's fun. Getting up and changing the lights each time is annoying, but it's fun. It's fun. This would keep him in the public eye, and he'd use the fact that astronauts would get mad at him when he'd gain access to their homes under false pretenses and then proceed to call them a liar over and over again as evidence of the fact that there was some sort of cover-up. Because if he was saying something that was wrong, why not just laugh at him? Why not just answer his questions? I mean, that's all he's doing. He's just jacking it. And again, as much as the ideas behind his movie are a hot pile of garbage, I can respect that he actually put a lot of care into the craft. So for our last piece of cinema, we will watch what is, in my opinion, the best presentation of this conspiracy theory. Bart SIbrel's A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. Now, you recall that Bart really only made it into this video not due to this documentary, but due to, again, getting punched in the face by Buzz Aldrin. Because again, I think that's what he really adds to the archetype of the modern conspiracy theory. However, I think it's worthwhile just going through the doc and dealing with a few things. Again, pretty much everything he's said we've already covered at this point, but let's just go through it. You're a trooper if you're still here, by the way. When I wrote the script, I did not realize it would be over 40 pages. I think my first draft before I had the debunk section was like 20, 25, something like that. I originally didn't even have a debunk section in this. Obviously, it would have shaved off a lot of time, but in some of my recent videos where I've talked more about methodology and less about specifics, people seem really hungry for the specifics. So I figure, I'll put them in, and then if you just want to skip to the methodology parts, that's what the chapter markers are for. So anyway, let's wrap this up. Again, the vast majority of what he talks about is nothing new. Pretty much every single thing we've already covered. There's a couple things, though, that I do want to touch on before we get to the Van Allen radiation belt. One thing that is funny, and this is going to be way too nitpicky, so I feel bad starting with this, but it was just something where, like, whenever I hear numbers, my brain just goes into, I wonder. So one small nitpick I'm going to make is SIbrel claims,
if adjusted for inflation to the 21st century, was $135 billion. $135 billion could feed 2 million people for their entire lives.
Which I'll admit, maybe my math is wrong on this, but I think he's off by quite a lot. Like double, and that's if we're being generous. So if you take the $135 billion, which is the 2000 equivalent of $1969, and then you divide that by 2 million, you get quite conveniently, 67,500. So that's how much money you get per person in total. Then take the cost of food and divide it by, let's just say 75 years. Technically, life expectancy was a bit higher, but we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. So you get $900. That's the cost per year you have to feed these people. Now divide that by 12 and you get $75 a month to feed people in 2001. Going off the USDA food plan, this really only works for children under 2 years of age. Like I said, this is a very, very minor detail, and it's not even worth it, but it was just something that quickly I was like, I wonder. It took me 2 seconds, and then I found it funny. So that's how we'll open this. So anyway, same stuff about shadows, dust, crosshairs, stars, wind, etc., etc. One thing I do want to give SIbrel credit for, though, is he updates the stars argument, because he says,
while they took 3 automobiles to the moon, they never took a photographic telescope. Had they done so, they would have been able to see farther into the universe than had ever before been realized.
Well, it's not him, obviously. He hired a voiceover actor. But again, it's his movie, which actually has a really straightforward answer. No telescope they could bring with them would have been nearly as powerful as the OA-02, the first ever space telescope launched by NASA in 1968, the previous year. So they couldn't have seen farther into the universe than anyone else had ever seen before. Like, even from within the module, you can see how much they have to close the shutter to just get Earth visible. And remember, the stars are dimmer than that. So if you brighten it enough, you know, to the point where maybe you can see the stars, look how much Earth blows out, as well as the inside of the cabin. So again, I just don't know that you would have been able to see stars with those cameras. Again, it's hard for your phone to capture stars in the night sky these days. So yeah. Anyway, similarly, when he mentions there's a shadowy organization that prompts the astronauts to talk with the word talk.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over. Okay, Roger, we're moving in on Earth.
SIbrel claims that he's been a commercial director. I'm sure he has been. I don't necessarily know why he'd make that up, but I would assume he's used comms before. Like, it's really common if you have a walkie or, you know, a headset or something, and you don't hit the right button. So if Armstrong hits the wrong button, and then someone else says, oh, remember, you need to hit this button too, and then Armstrong turns it on, and they say, talk. And that's what you hear before Armstrong starts speaking. Now, as much as you might say, that's kind of a reach, that's not actually the thing I'm going to hang my hat on. The thing I am going to hang my hat on is the ambient background noise. So when this person says talk, ambient background noise is introduced. If you assume that the astronauts are then going to come on to the call after that, we should hear a different ambience come into play as well. However, we don't hear a different ambience. We hear the exact same ambience. It doesn't change at all. Like, here, listen. Actually, I need to interrupt before we play the audio because I need to make something very clear. SIbrel was being sneaky again. So here's the original audio. I just want you to look at the waveform. We'll play them side by side in a second here, but just look at the waveform. Now here's SIbrel's waveform of the exact same moment. Notice how SIbrel's waveform goes up a little bit there. Now let's listen. SIbrel raised that part of the waveform to make it sound like new audio was being introduced right before that person says talk, because the word talk obscures the new ambient noise being introduced, because obviously it's being introduced right when they say the word talk because they're interrupting that person. So SIbrel does know how comms work. SIbrel actually is perfectly aware, and he was so aware of how comms work that he went into the audio and edited it so that if anyone was going to call him on this in the exact way I'm doing right now, they would hear that extra ambience and go, oh, listen, extra ambience was added, ignoring the fact that that's not in the NASA original. Again, he's manipulating the underlying evidence because he doesn't think his own evidence is strong enough by itself. When I played it back, my first thought was literally, oh, damn, there is extra ambience added. Maybe I was wrong about this and I have to change, or say, oh, maybe they were being dishonest, or maybe there was a third party or something like that. But then I thought to myself, well, why is the ambience starting with the word talk? Because you can hear it behind the word talk. Why is it so much more dramatic than the tiny bit of ambience I hear before? And that's when I noticed he raised the waveform. And I already had the original from NASA downloaded at that point, so I just compared the two side by side, realized what had happened, and I was like, this guy's an absolute fraud who went out of his way to make this look worse than it actually was. And what annoys me the most is he has the gall to say,
well, why would they fake being 100,000, 30,000 miles out if they were really 130,000 miles out?
But he's being dishonest to make them look dishonest. It's gross. It's just gross. And he would never apply the same standard to himself. And he'll never talk to me now. That's the thing. I should have saved this. I feel that's the worst part. Whenever I make videos like this, it's like, I mean, there's no chance he was probably going to debate me anyway, because my video's small and who cares. But I always get nervous when I attack people like this, because it's like, I'd rather debate them. I'd rather just talk to them face to face and, you know, have us each present our arguments. But one of the things, because these video essays are kind of stupid in a way, because no one's pushing back on me. I'm just kind of talking into a void right now. But then I'm always like, what am I supposed to do? Present a worse version of my argument in the hopes I can lull them into a false sense of security so I can debate them? Like, it's stupid. If you're going to watch this video, I want you to be informed. I want you to see the results of my research. I'm proud of all the research I've done. I've uncovered a lot of stuff in this
I haven't seen anyone else ever uncover, including the manipulations that SIbrel did. Like, I'm proud of finding stuff like that. And it's just... Anyway, sorry, I'm ranting. This is not showmanship, this is dishonesty. And frankly, any SIbrel fans watching this, you go tell him I'm saying all this, and then you tell me what his excuse is. And I'm sure I'm gonna get a bunch of people saying SIbrel doesn't matter or he's meaningless, but Jara White's not going on Joe Rogan. Jara White's not going on Candace Owens. Again, in a similar sense, he claims that James Webb, the director of NASA and now of telescope fame,
NASA's highest-ranking official, James Webb, resigned without explanation just days before the first Apollo mission. Why, when he was on the threshold of achieving the greatest accomplishment of his career?
But he did explain. He was leaving because Johnson said he wasn't going to run again. And he wanted the next president to be able to, you know, pick the new head of NASA. And on top of that, knowing that the moon landing was about to happen, he probably wanted the new head of NASA to have as much time as possible with the crew to make sure that, you know, they were familiar enough to oversee the project. His replacement was Thomas O. Paine, who became the acting head the second that James Webb stepped down, and would become the actual head when Nixon appointed and then he was confirmed in Nixon's term. So, again, I just not necessarily am going to buy when he's like, he stepped down and he gave no explanation and it was so out of the blue, and why would he do this right before his achievement? Because there was a new president, and the new president was probably going to replace him anyway, because when a new president comes in, one of the things they often do is they fire a bunch of the previous agency heads and appoint their own. It's just not that uncommon. Also, once I realized a lot of what SIbrel had done in post, I figured it was actually worth it to address a few more things he brought up on Rogan. The one I want to talk about right now is he mentions that this whole scene was actually like a behind-the-scenes thing we weren't supposed to see, where the lights come up and we see the background that we weren't supposed to be able to see. This is despite the astronauts being in zero gravity, so kind of weird to prep all the special effects for something we weren't supposed to be able to see. But anyway, even ignoring that, what SIbrel claims is
the shot is attained by putting the camera's lens to the window's glass, as it would have to be if they were the claimed distance away from the Earth.
We only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with the TV camera.
Well, you saw them fiddle around in the window.
You definitely see them fiddle around in the window.
And the camera, they lied about the camera being up against the glass. The camera is obviously at the back of the spacecraft to create that illusion.
They said they can't.
Rogan actually tries to give him an out where he points out that there is a slang when you're capturing something with the camera where you say, oh, my camera is filled with the window, you know, that it's like filled with it or whatever. But that actually is completely unnecessary, because the next thing that happens is NASA says,
11 Houston, if you could comply, we'd like to see some smiling faces up there. If you could give us some interior views, I'm sure everybody'd like to see you. Over. Okay, we'll reconfigure the TV for that. Roger.
And then he moves the camera. Now, I'm sure there's going to be a ton of people in the comments saying, well, what about this clip? What about that clip? And again, that's one of the strengths of JAQing. You kind of just need a bunch of clips, even if there's nothing wrong with any of them, because by the time it takes someone to go through all of them, you know, it's kind of not going to be worth it. For anyone listening, usually a good technique is to just say, oh, you know, where'd you see that? Can you give me a link to the original source? 9 out of 10 times, they're going to say, I just saw it on a YouTube video. I don't have the original source. And then it's really easy to just go, oh, that's crazy, because I've got a video from this guy, Portable Orange, and he gave direct links to everything he talks about, so why did he link to this stuff but your guy didn't? And then at the very least, they should stop responding. Anyway, home stretch. We got one last thing to talk about. The Van Allen radiation belt. This is a favorite of the moon landing conspiracy theorists, and interestingly, it actually came along a little bit after Kaysing. Okay, here's the biggest part I had to re-record because it turns out radiation is super complicated. But the biggest problem here isn't even the radiation, it's that all these numbers come from space probes. These space probes are probes that were launched by government agencies. So if you don't believe the government agencies, it's very easy to dismiss literally everything I'm about to say as, well, you can't trust that because it comes from the government. Even though, again, the big numbers that everyone uses also come from the government. SIbrel actually does a pretty good job explaining it, but his explanation is a little long, and I don't just want to, like, play his video for 3 minutes.
while I just sit here collecting my ad revenue. So I'm going to do my best to explain it. But again, SIbrel's movie, the Fox special, Kaysing's book, everything is linked in the companion document. Basically, Earth is spinning, and as we spin, we generate a magnetic field. This is probably because there is solid iron in the core, and then it rubs against the magma of the inner core, and that produces electricity. I don't exactly know how. I know it has something to do with electrons and conductive current, but I don't exactly know how. Anyway, because that produces electrons, that also produces electromagnetic radiation, which radiates outwards from the Earth. It's part of what gives us our atmosphere, and also what causes the Van Allen radiation belt. These are basically the edges of the magnetic field of Earth, and therefore these fields catch a lot of the radiation that comes from the sun, like from solar flares and the like. So these are essentially areas of space that are supercharged with very, very high energy particles. And high energy particles can be damaging to you. In fact, there's a very famous high energy particle you probably know of, uranium, that's very damaging to people. That's not only an oversimplified version, but I'm not a physicist, a geologist, an astronomer, or anything else. So it's entirely possible I'm getting some stuff wrong, and I might even end up VOing this section. This is sort of similar to if you spin a magnet in a coil, you can generate power. That was always one of my big things of the world. If society collapses, I'd be like, I know how to make a water wheel generator. That's why they won't kill me. Anyway, because the sun is constantly doing massive amounts of nuclear fusion to turn hydrogen into helium, thanks, they might be giants, it's basically always going to be giving out a certain amount of radiation because, much like anything else, the particles are going to escape in that process. Radicals, I should say. So as solar radiation gets caught in that field, we sort of end up with a circulating, orbit of these particles. And those particles are actually really important to Earth because that's what protects us from solar flares and the like, because again, it gets caught in the field, which is full of these particles. Fun fact, when we talk about the northern lights, a lot of that has to do with some of that radiation getting through these fields, or the fields interacting quite closely. The US has actually been aware of and studying these belts for a while now. In fact, we set off a nuke once to see if it would affect the radiation levels of the belts. The answer was yes. Now, the limits of the inner belt vary. It's not like a solid, very obvious ball. But it starts about 600 miles away from Earth, 1,000 kilometers-ish, and it goes to like 11,000 kilometers, like 7,000 miles-ish. Just for reference, the International Space Station is at like 250 miles, 300 miles-ish, depending on where it is in its orbit. Now, the inner belt, the radiation is actually pretty strong. It's about 1,000 times stronger than anything you're naturally going to be exposed to on Earth. So to very quickly explain, see how this says the upper limit would be 23,000 SV a year? So in order to convert all that into millisieverts a second, we first divide by the year, 365, and then it's 63 sieverts a day, then 24 for hours, 60 for minutes, another 60 for seconds, and then multiply the whole thing by 1,000, because again, remember, we want millisieverts, not sieverts. Just like 1 meter is 1,000 millimeters, we multiply, which gets us 0.73 millisieverts a second. As the astronauts were in the belt for, according to NASA, about 52 minutes each way, that would put their totals, math here, at 4,400 millisieverts, which, just to be clear, is basically right at the lethal dose for about half of the population. So they would have been experiencing some severe side effects. And indeed, this is the number you'll hear most people throw out. Problem is, if you remember, that's in the densest, worst part of the belt. And NASA charted a course that didn't go through those parts of the belt. But just to be clear, they didn't just chart that course because it would go through the weaker parts of the belt. They charted that course because that's the only way you can get to the moon. Note this chart here showing the relative positions of the Earth and the moon. The moon is not equatorially aligned with the Earth, unlike the Van Allen radiation belts, which are equatorially aligned with the Earth. Well, technically they're aligned with the poles, but it's a 90-degree angle. It's the same thing, basically. This also makes sense because of how the moon moves through the night sky. You can see it get pretty far overhead, and depending on where you live at certain times of year, it might actually be directly overhead during the night sometimes. If it was stuck in an equatorial loop, it would always be overhead at least once during the night, but only if you lived at the equator. Otherwise, it would never be directly overhead. Now, in those green areas of the belt that you can see here, things are a lot thinner. So the question now becomes, what's the radiation levels in those parts of the belts? So this was a tricky part to research, actually. There isn't a lot of great documentation on the kind of distribution of radiation within the Van Allen radiation belts. However, the easiest I can find is this right here, which shows that it is at, it goes off by a factor of 10 each time. Let's just assume the entire time they were actually in the second worst band. Well, if it's a factor of 10 lower, then they're only going to have 440 millisieverts. But again, their path wasn't just through the second worst parts of the belt. NASA has a version that shows the parts they were in. I'm going to link it in the opinion doc, but obviously, if you don't believe in this stuff, you're not going to believe anything NASA says anyway. So let's just say that they spent half of that time in the third worst of the belts, which back of the envelope now takes us down to 242 millisieverts. In addition, keep in mind that the shielding on the Apollo module wasn't 1/10 of an inch. It was 6 millimeters, which is a little closer to 2/10 of an inch, which means at the very least we can have it, technically 2.3, but whatever. We can have it. Now you're at 121 millisieverts or 12 rads. Now, if you consult the chart, you'll notice that's still high. In fact, it's just above what they consider to be the 5-year limit for people who work with radioactive materials. But it's about a third of the people who were relocated from Chernobyl in the wake of the disaster. And cancer rates among those groups, while slightly higher than the general population, isn't anything crazy. The vast majority of them still live to a normal age. And keep in mind, this is me just doing back-of-the-envelope calculation by the numbers the skeptics like so much. If you trust NASA, well, they measured the astronaut's skin and it was like 0.18 rads or something like that, like 18 millisieverts. But again, I think it's more effective to do the back-of-the-envelope math ourselves, because to the skeptics, just saying, well, you should just look at the NASA stuff is never going to be effective, which frankly, you know what, fair enough. I'm also going to link a study, because I found it kind of interesting, that shows that astronauts actually don't have a ridiculously higher rate of dying from cancer. The study says that there's no significant correlation, but it is a couple percent higher, so I don't necessarily know about that. But what they do significantly not die from as much is cardiovascular disease, which when you think about the athletic requirements of being an astronaut, that kind of makes a little bit more sense. I'm going to link another study too that I also found interesting, that the flashes that the astronauts saw may have actually led to the fact that astronauts, a lot of them anyway, seem to have an increased risk of developing cataracts later in life. It was a little too technical for me, and I'm going to be honest, it doesn't really relate to much of anything, but it was just sort of interesting reading about that. So while there is radiation in the belts, and radiation is obviously bad, you're exposed to things on Earth which have more potential to give you radiation on a regular basis, like X-ray machines. Oh, also, after watching SIbrel on Rogan last night, again, after I'd finished my script when I was coming here to film, I have actually sort of completely changed my view on this guy. And on top of that, he said that he has never actually debated anyone, that no one wants to debate him. So, I'm also re-recording this part because A, I said, Bart SIbrel, my name is Portable Orange. And that, when I listened to that back, that was cringe. That was really cringe. So I'm going to do a second take. So Mr. SIbrel, my name is Andrew, and I am hereby formally challenging you to a debate on whether or not the moon landing happened. I don't care where it is. I don't care what time it is. We can do it on your channel. We can do it on my channel. But I would be more than happy to give you the first debate of your career. I have watched your films, I have engaged with the material, and I guarantee you it would be a rigorous conversation for the both of us. Also, for anyone else who wants to debate me on this, send me an email. Like, maybe I should set up a second channel or something so I can do debates somewhere, because I always feel bad when it's like, I'll debate you on your channel and it's someone with 100 subs who obviously just wants exposure, which, look, if you're going to debate me, I'm happy to give it to you. There are very big channels who refuse to debate me, and I'm not going to turn into that because that's stupid. Now, I also had to re-record the ending because as much as I just wanted this video to be a fun exploration of conspiracy theories, I realized I can't make that the ending. Because the more and more I looked into this, I realized something. Moon landing denial is 90% about money. So let's end with Port's conspiracy theory. Kaysing ends his book by just shilling his other books. Remember when I said that, list of his books is how he ends it? He's recommending you buy his own books. And SIbrel, when he was on Joe Rogan, actually annoyed Rogan by at first not giving Rogan a lot of the clips or saying we should look at this photo or this thing, and instead just saying, well, everyone should go to my website over and over again right off the top.
What they would say is that it's not that dangerous, and it's just like being exposed to a few x-rays, and that the people were shielded.
Well, go to SIbrel.com and watch a latest clip about it.
But you're right there, so I just want to give you the opportunity.
I'm just saying,
I feel like the modern people who are in control of these conversations just commodified the natural human curiosity. And therefore, anytime some big event happens, the first thought in their heads is, what's the most interesting story I can tell so that I can make money off this? I don't have a Patreon. I'm not selling merch. I don't actually have a way to make money. I need to. I know for a fact that I should start setting up revenue streams, but I'm lazy. And money just isn't nearly as important to me as the fun I have digging into stuff like this. Whereas the people that I'm speaking against right now have multiple revenue streams that they shill constantly when they bring up stuff like this, stuff they do very little research into. But to me, that sort of grift economy neatly ties into the real problem of JAQing, which I think is going to make for a much better ending to this video. This might feel like it's coming out of left field, but I don't think JAQing is that bad in isolation. I think the idea of questioning people, questioning authority, questioning official narratives is frankly a healthy thing. I believe governments do shady stuff, and I believe they will go to extreme lengths sometimes to cover that stuff up. There's evidence of stuff like that happening throughout history, and frankly, a natural skepticism is good and something we should encourage in people. Part of why I do my companion document and engage with people who disagree with me in the comment section so much is to encourage that type of behavior. But that's not what JAQing is. What I think is so dangerous, so bad about JAQing is how it trains your brain to be satisfied with just doubt. You see, when you look at this photo and you see that the shadows don't line up, a question should form in your brain. Why aren't these shadows parallel? When I'm outside in the sunlight, shadows are parallel. Why aren't they parallel here? That's a great thing, and that's a great start. What that should lead you to do is track down the original photo. Look at other photos that were taken around it. See if you can't come up with a reason as to why the shadows might not be parallel. And if you can't find one, well then maybe you can say that that first photo doesn't make sense. But just seeing the photo by itself, that's only a good place to start. It should never be where you finish. But to many people, that's going to be enough. They're going to see that the shadows don't line up, and the next thing that they'll do is look at a different photo where the shadows don't line up. They're never going to go back to that original photo and figure out the context. They're never going to genuinely sit down and pore through the material. They're just going to move on to a different photo and a different photo. And they're always going to end up in this place where they feel like they're engaging with the underlying material because to their mind, they know so many individual pieces of information. But at the end of the day, they know very little about all of those pieces of information. Now, I don't mean to say all this to imply that you need to become an expert on any topic to speak on it. Lord knows I certainly don't do that. And to be fair, most people just simply don't have time to do that level of research, which is also fair. But then what you should do is trust the people who spend a lot of time looking into stuff like this, namely experts and academics. Now, you may point out that NASA has a reason to lie if it is fake. After all, they'd be the ones who faked it, and therefore you shouldn't trust their experts as much. And frankly, that's perfectly fair. But the problem is, the moment you run into someone else, that same standard isn't applied to them. When it comes to SIbrel or Kaysing, you don't notice how often they shill their products. You never think to yourself that they may also have a financial reason to lie about the moon landing. Because at the end of the day, NASA's the government. These are just random independent researchers. But then my question is going to be, what do you make of me? Probably you're going to say I'm a Fed, I'm a glowy, I'm being paid by NASA or something like that. But why isn't it possible there's some organization paying Kaysing or SIbrel as well? Am I only getting paid because at the end of the day, I'm just saying something you don't agree with? Is there really no possibility that someone could look at all the information I've looked at throughout the course of this video and conclude the moon landing did happen? And this, I think, is the biggest problem of JAQing. And frankly, why I think it's so easily poisoning the minds of so many people online these days. Because JAQing, at the end of the day, isn't about engaging with the evidence. It isn't about finding the truth hidden behind the lies. It's about trusting the experts. You don't have time to look into the moon landing. You don't have time to look up mRNA or how thermite works. No, all you have time for is a 2-hour video, is a short podcast. All you have time for is to listen to someone else tell you how things are. And I mean, this person's speaking truth to power. I mean, surely that's worth a couple bucks. And it trains you not to think in terms of truth and lies, but in terms of tribalism, what side they're on, what opinion they're presenting. It's honestly depressing to me that I can just say a couple shibboleths, a couple dog whistles here and there, and suddenly a lot of people who were very kind of opposed to me suddenly are much more willing to listen to what I have to say. Because I've said the right words, I've showed that I understand where they're coming from. I, at least at one point, was part of a community that they're also a part of. And now suddenly my opinion is worth far more consideration than it was worth 5 seconds ago, when I had the exact same evidence, because the evidence didn't matter to begin with. So questioning is good, questioning is fantastic, and again, it's something we should be encouraging in people. But that's not what JAQing is. JAQing is just taking an old model of trusting the scientists and the experts and the historians and replacing it with trusting the podcasters. I wish I could end on a slightly better note, but again, this is why I will say I will debate anyone on the moon landing or this issue in general. Partly because I know no one will ever take me up on it. Well, I shouldn't say that. I'm sure at some point someone will take me up on some of the debates, but on a much larger part, it's because I want to teach people the tools that JAQers claim to have. If you made it this far, I appreciate it. Like and subscribe if you haven't. Please donate to Car for Ukraine. It's only available for another couple weeks because it takes me far too long to get videos out. But we're doing well. I'm really hoping we can hit the goal before the end of the month. And if we can't, that's okay too. Just as much as we've raised, I'm already so incredibly proud of this community. Definitely let me know what you think about this kind of video. I think exploring conspiracy theories or stuff like this is fun. I like ancient history. I have a lot more planned for ancient history as well. But I think some modern stuff could be really fun as well. So just interested in what you think about deep dives in general. Probably there's some other incredibly niche deep dives I'd love to do at some point, but I'm just curious what y'all think of it. Oh, and the set. Let me know what you think of the set, especially the old board here. I was proud of this, honestly, when I came up with this, and then I didn't use it enough. And I know I didn't use it enough. I should have used it more, but I just kind of did it, and there we go. There's more stuff I want to do too, but I don't know. I love this idea of like faux intellectualism. I really want to get a shelf with a bunch of baby books so that if anyone ever does debate me, I can just sit in front of a bunch of baby books while they're sitting in front of this like big library, you know, and I have like C-Spot Run behind me and they have like the complete unabridged annals of Tacitus. I don't know. I just think that'd be really funny, but it's because I'm sort of a troll. So, God, I'm so bad at ending videos. I shouldn't end them with blog posts. I was thinking that because I'm like, someone's going to come across this video in like a year and be like, what is this blog post I'm listening to? So, till next time, take care.